The TEFL Commute, Season 2, Episode 5, Translate, in which we talk about todo lo que se refiere a la traducción, everything about translation. Let's get started.
You're listening to the TEFL Commute podcast.
I just said, do you want to play football? He couldn't really understand me. Well, I don't speak Spanish. Glenn speaks a wee bit. Hola. That's about it.
I've been using Google Translate in work, so I thought I'd just give Gary the app on my phone.
Go play left-hand side, okay?
Ve a jugar en el lado izquierdo.
That's the breakthrough we needed.
Hi, Sean.
Hi, Lindsay. So, Google Translate makes you play football better. Is that
Yes, I think that's the message that we can derive. We just played for our listeners here at the top of the show a clip from a commercial we found online for Google Translate, the latest and greatest translation software that's out now, that is recognizing voice as well as text inputted on a phone or indeed photos of text and can translate them.
it's bringing communities closer together.
Yes. Translate. What we want to talk about in today's episode is a little bit about translation software, how it is, what's coming, what is the state of it now, how this relates to language teaching, and we're going to touch on a few other fun things about translation. But let me start by asking you, Sean, have you used Google Translate?
I have. I've got Google Translate on my phone, and I've actually used Google Translate with students as well. But I mean, personally, I've got Google Translate on my phone, which I use from time to time. As listeners know, we travel a lot, and I do find it quite handy to use from time to time, especially with menus. But it's something I've always been interested in because I like augmented reality, and the sad techie bit is that Google Translate bought an app called Word Lens a couple of years ago, which basically, if you held over any picture, I think it was Spanish and French, it automatically changed the language into English, and I found that fascinating. And Google Translate bought it, and it's now part of Google Translate itself. So, kind of the mobile user geeky me likes Translate, but also as a traveller, it is fun or useful to type it in here and there. Do you use it?
I've used it a couple of times. I've never gotten to the point of using it like holding up the phone, saying something, and then have the phone say it to the person. I've not gone that far. Partly it just seems it would just take that extra time for me to like pull the phone out, do that, and it kind of would interrupt the things. I would probably be gesturing more. What about, there's Google is big in the translate field, but also Skype now. Skype has Skype Instant Translation. Have you tried that?
It's only in beta, isn't it? I haven't tried it, but I've sort of kept abreast of what's happening with it. If I remember rightly, it's most fluent in Portuguese.
Okay.
I can't. I think I was. That's the last thing I saw. These two things are the death of language teaching, aren't they?
Well, that's interesting. I used to be very skeptical of machine translation. When students used to have lots of my students used to have these little, like they were kind of Casio type calculators, like long, thin black machines with little keyboards on them, and they would use those a lot in class. And I would always be warning them, don't depend on this. It's just a word-for-word translation. But recently, I've seen stuff from Google Translate get a lot better at recognizing phrases, chunks, formula language, and just getting the tone a bit better. That being said, I can still usually tell if a student submits something to me that has been done through a machine translation. Can't you? Isn't there something about it?
There's something just stylistically that you could tell has come from the machine, can't you?
I think the word probably for me would be uncanny. There's a little bit of uncanniness, and it just feels like not not human type mistake. I don't know what it is, but maybe even that will be getting better soon. I'm not sure. But it is, recently, from the recording of this episode, there had been a webinar, I think, or an online event called The Future of ELT.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yeah. And Scott Thornbury, who was a guest on our last episode, actually called this online translation the elephant in the room when talking about the future of ELT. So do you think this is going to eventually reduce the need for teachers? That's, I suppose, one of the quests for language teachers. That's one of the questions many of us might be asking ourselves.
It's funny, isn't it? There's that meme been doing the rounds for years, like technology won't replace teachers, but teachers that don't use technology will, or something. I can't remember. Do you know what I'm talking about? And it's
I don't think it's exactly that. I think you said teachers who don't. The way you said it sounds like teachers who don't use technology will replace technology. But I think I understand the meme. I think our listeners understand the meme as well. It's all.
I'll find it and I'll put it on the. And I think when that meme came out, it was probably true. But I guess there is a danger that if translation gets so instantaneous, that, you know, I mean, this idea of the Skype conversation is that I could, as we're talking on Skype now, and we're both using English, but I mean, Skype are aiming that you could be speaking Spanish and me speaking English, and we'd understand each other instantaneously. Which I think, you know, if you think of a lot of the students that we teach are learning for business communication and so on. I can't see how it won't have an effect on that. You?
No, I think it can. I mean, we could argue also that, you know, translation has always been a part of language teaching, even though for the past, well, one could argue it's only been over the past sort of almost 100 years that it got, that it went through a period of having a bit of a bad name, you know, banning the use of the student's own language in class, no translation in class. It would get in the way of sort of thinking in the foreign language. But I think it's always been a part of language teaching. Do you use translation in class?
I have done I've worked in monolingual. I've worked in more monolingual than multilingual classrooms, and I think translation. I always felt translation was easier in a monolingual classroom, and even where I've not spoke the language fully, I still think you can use translation as a tool. I always found it interesting if all the students were saying the same word, then they were all, you know, they were translating words from L1 to L2, and if they all came up with the same word, then they were probably all right, or I guess all wrong. So yes, I have, and there are lots of interesting translations. It's kind of like translations become back into fashion now, hasn't it?
I think it has. I mean, it's that just brings us nicely onto this next little clip that I wanted to share with you. When you said translations back into fashion, I think a couple of books have helped bring it back into fashion, including the latest one, which is an award-winning book by Philip Kerr called Translation in Own Language Activities, which is great, full of activities incorporating translation, including machine and Google translation. I've used this quite a few times, some of the activities. Why don't we hear from him telling us a little bit about how a brief history of translation in language teaching.
If you wanted to learn a language in 16th century Western Europe, one way of doing so was to go to a language school or get a private tutor. Among the most fashionable and influential educators of the time were the Valencian scholar Juan Luis Vives and the English scholar Roger Ascham. Vives and Ascham both recommended extensive use of reverse or back translation, and this is an activity that involves translating a text from one language to another and then back again. Not everyone agreed with them. The Fleming, Nicholas Kleinarts, claimed that he taught his students in what could be described as a 16th century precursor of the direct method. He used only Latin to teach Latin, and he claimed good results for his method. There is, however, ample testimony to the greater popularity of the approach of Vives and Ascham. On the other side of the Mediterranean, in Istanbul, which was the largest city of the Western world at that time, there were schools for translators and interpreters, dragomans as they were known. In newly conquered South America, the conquistadors and missionaries needed interpreters, and these were trained. Learning a language and translating between two languages were inextricably linked activities. From this time on, The steady growth in school provision across Europe, at least for boys, was accompanied by the teaching of Latin and Greek, the classical languages so beloved of Renaissance scholars. Known as grammar translation, the standard classroom approach entailed translation of extracts from classical authors, combined with writing exercises. When modern languages began to replace Latin and Greek in the curriculum in the 19th century, the teaching methodology remained largely unchanged. In some contexts, even today, grammar translation remains the norm. There were, however, some who questioned the appropriacy of this approach, and the beginning of the debate about the use of the learner's own language can be traced to this period. The beginning of the 20th century saw a growing market for language schools, not least because of the development of rapid international transport. By the end of the century, these schools had grown into a multi-billion-dollar global business. By and large, they have tried to distinguish themselves from language teaching in state-run institutions, both secondary and tertiary, where the use of the student's own language is much more common. Precise figures are hard to come by, because we rely on teachers reporting their own practices. But it would seem that the use of translation remains the norm in university teaching around the world. In secondary and primary schools, it's reasonable to assume that elements of translation or own language use are unavoidable. There are, however, some important exceptions.
The other work, you said there were two ways. I guess the other work you're referring to is Guy Cook.
Yes, Phil mentions Guy Cook's work on translation. Translation, is that translation and language teaching? I think it's called.
Yeah, Guy was speaking at a conference I organised a few years ago. I remember him, and it was kind of to a group of people who's organised the International House Organisation, and of course it's through what they started doing in the 1950s. And he stood up and said it was basically because of us that translation died, because all these teachers on their 4-week courses didn't speak the language of the students, so language got banned as the use of L1 got banned because of the 4 weeks. Became the cell.
Well, to sort of justify the fact that you could become a language teacher in such a short amount of time and then go teach anywhere in the world without learning the language.
Absolutely, yeah. But it was kind of amusing, kind of telling this room of people, and then the realization there is actually very little research into, that everybody's saying, you should use only L1. And I still find it fascinating, wearing one of my hats as a kind of school inspector. You go into schools where there's like English only, you can't speak the L1, you've got to be in English in the classroom. And I always say, well, when I was learning language, if I was learning Czech, I still had to rely on English sometimes. I just mainly as a safety net, as a stress relief.
Definitely. Of course, I mean, segueing back into translation and translation devices, I think this has been I found a really interesting thing I'd like to share with you. We were talking at the top of the show about Skype and Google and talking into devices and them translating it. Does that feel sort of freaky or not? It's been a long dream of science fiction to include universal translation. I have a list here of a few of them I just wanted to share with you, Sean. I think you and I, being sci-fi fans and geeks a bit, will appreciate this. Here are some of the more well-known English language shows that have used talks about universal translators. So Doctor Who, in the Doctor Who TV show, the TARDIS uses a telepathic field which translates most comprehensible languages into a language understood by its pilot and each of the crew members.
It's a wonderful little plot device, isn't it?
Isn't it? Yeah. It says also the field also translates what they say into a language appropriate for that time. So remember, they travel in time in Doctor Who. So they speak the appropriate dialect of Latin when in ancient Rome.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I'm obviously Doctor Who. I'm a massive Whovian, so this is something I do. It does make me laugh laugh at how much that is a plot device, but yes. And if you've travelled in the TARDIS, then if you've been in the TARDIS, then you automatically pick up this the translation ability. So
yeah, I mean, another one is another British one, A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This is quite a well-known one. The universal translation is made possible by a small fish called a Babel fish.
In fact, if you stop there, I can play it.
The Babel fish is small, yellow, leech-like, and probably the oddest thing in the universe. It feeds on brainwave energy, absorbing all unconscious frequencies and then excreting telepathically a matrix formed from the conscious frequencies and nerve signals picked up from the speech centers of the brain. The practical upshot of which is that if you stick one in your ear, you instantly understand anything said to you in any form of language.
Right, so the fish is inserted into the ear, where it feeds off the mental frequencies of those speaking to the host. And it excretes a translation. I love the way they describe those on Wikipedia. It excretes a translation into the brain of the host. So it's like leaking into your brain. Yes, I also, here we have Neuromancer.
I don't know Neuromancer.
No, it's the William Gibson's, like, cyberpunk.
Oh, okay, yeah. I was thinking of TV show.
No, in this one here, it's like small chips are plugged behind the user's ear, giving them certain knowledge.
Oh, okay.
And finally, one of the really well-known ones, of course, is Star Trek, the Universal Translator. So, this is how does it work?
But that's quite an interesting one. Let's just have a clip of that.
The Universal Translator is coming online, sir.
Ugly, giant bags of mostly water.
Bags of mostly water? An accurate description of humans, sir. You are over 90% water surrounded by a flexible container.
And I think that highlights another point. Well, two things. I think these things are very close, or obviously, I mean, Google Translate and Skype are getting closer and closer to this science fiction dream. Wouldn't you say?
I would, yeah, definitely.
And this idea of actually having a chip, I don't think is a strange one anymore. Anyway, because you've got, I mean, there's been a number of instances this year where people have been chipping themselves. Is that what we would say? putting a chip, into their arms, and that will activate certain technologies. I mean, as wearable technology is becoming more sophisticated, then I can't see it being a big leap from kind of taking a chip that you can embed that will translate for you.
Well, it's interesting also that the technology seems to be going more in the way of of these shows that I mentioned, like the Babel fish in your ear, the Neuromancer chip, as opposed to what Star Wars did. Because if we remember, Star Wars, the translator is often, or the role is not of something inserted into a person. It's often done via C-3PO. So via a droid, who you could almost think of as like the modern version of what Philip was talking about about the Dragomans, the translators. So C-3PO is like kind of like whatever, the diplomatic aid that you walk around with. Whereas it looks like they're not building kind of robot type things that would communicate for you, but trying to get closer and closer to something where you speak and then the other thing just comes out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The other thing about that Star Trek quote, the Star Trek clip that we played, is the bags of water. And I think that actually shows us where translation still has to go. And one of the things that I said at the beginning of the show is the translator the death of language teaching. And I think the answer is probably still no, because these things aren't sophisticated enough to actually work out context, co-text, and meaning. In that level, they're just very much denotation rather than connotation devices.
Yes, that's true. And of course, there will always be words which cannot be translated easily into another language. I have another list that I'd would like to share with you, Sean, and with our
like
listeners.
lists on this
I
podcast.
do like lists. I'm a list guy. But these are, if you look online, there's several kind of websites and lists and books and stuff on words, foreign words that do not exist in English. Just the right word for something, but it doesn't exist in English. Schadenfreude, I think, is one of the ones that is used in English. It's a German word meaning sort of pleasure at a friend's pain or something like that.
Yes, yeah.
But here are some other ones. Now, my apologies, by the way, to anyone who speaks these languages and says later and hears this and gets outraged because I've got it wrong. I've taken this from two websites, neither of which are perhaps that authoritative, but we'll see. So here are some words, foreign words that do not exist in English, but that would be great if they did. So here's let's see the German. Let's start with the German one. Kummerspeck. Kummerspeck is excess weight gained.
Something to do with bacon.
Yes, that's right. It's excess weight gained from emotional overeating. And literally it means grief bacon. I love grief bacon. Here's one from Georgian. Shimomejamo. This word means sort of like you're full, but you can't stop eating. So like that feeling when you're really full, but you just keep going. And literally, shimomejano means I accidentally ate the whole thing, which is great.
I'd be saying that every day.
Yes, exactly. Then there's another German one. This one is my favorite one. I wish this existed. I do know several. Backpfeifengesicht. Pfeifengesicht is a face badly in need of a fist. So someone has a Backpfeifengesicht, unless I'm pronouncing it wrong. Filipino, a giggle, or giggle. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It means the urge to pinch or squeeze something that is irresistibly cute. Yeah, so babies' cheeks perhaps are giggles. Yeah.
Oh, okay, fair enough. I was just trying to think of languages that I know and whether there are words in there that don't translate.
Yeah, there's another one here from Czech, but I don't know. I know.
I can pronounce it. I've never heard of it. So the word is vibafnut.
Vibafnut, and it means to jump out and say boo. Well, that's what it says here on this website.
It does, yeah. It's an interesting list. I'm looking at the list there.
I wonder if that's a verb. Like, do you vibafnut somebody? He vibafnuted me.
It's good to go in the direction. Yeah, no. Oh, well, that's interesting. There's a very long list of words, isn't it?
There is a long list of words. Boketo, Japanese. The act of gazing vacantly into the distance without thinking. So that's nice. Boketo.
So well, that's kind of. I mean, those kind of lists, are again. Go back to what we say, don't they? If you can't translate them in English, what do you do? The universal translator. Does it give the whole definition? I guess it's.
I guess, yeah. Like, how would that work with a? I mean, there aren't that.
I guess it's the same with the words that we. I mean, English does adopt foreign words. Maybe they just appear as they are, and there's an assumption we'll learn what that word means. So
yeah.
But it's also the case for mistranslation. I mean, it's interesting. I think it was just yesterday in the British newspapers, as the British newspapers would, were falling over themselves in fits of laughter about the Spanish village or Spanish town that had used Google Translate to name its festival, and they were. I think it was a vegetable or something, a festival of a various vegetable, but they'd use Translate, and instead of getting the word, they got the word clitoris. So they were advertising a clitoris festival.
Now you see, we didn't hear about that in Spain, so that's very weird.
That's interesting. I mean, it was pretty much in every online version of the UK newspapers.
I mean, no talk about Translate probably, in terms of language teachers as well, would be complete without a mention of what was last year's #1 app, I think, in the App Store, which is Duolingo. Duolingo, of course, is an app. If you haven't heard about it, it's an app that works on the basis of translation. It argues that it is teaching languages, but the method is purely translating. So translating sentences back and forth, and also encouraging users to translate other sentences, in Czech translations, which also gave rise to me hearing that some of how Duolingo was making some of its money was selling these translations generated for free by users then to like translation software companies. Did you hear that too, Sean?
Yeah, I'd heard that. And I know people that use Duolingo and are perfect, that say very positive things about it.
Yeah, I know a lot of people who love Duolingo. I always say to them, "Okay, tell me again in 6 months if you still love it, and then I'll believe you." I mean, I've tried it a little bit, but I got bored. And also, Duolingo is another poster child for the whole gamification story. It does gamification quite well. It does get that little. It creates that little kind of hit that you get from doing it and getting a new badge. Duolingo also, a very kind of TEFL Commute type thing here would be to find some of the funnier sentences that Duolingo asks you to translate. So just as we were saying about odd translations, Duolingo is not immune. There's a great website called WTF Duolingo. We'll put a link to it in the show. Here are some sample sentences that Duolingo has given people to translate where they get translated back. So here, for example, translate, "I am not healthy." Okay, that's all right. But "I want to eat apples because they contain water." "I want a hard stone."
It's kind of there's almost a flip back to the life sentence episode with those.
Well, yeah, it does sound like that. Yes, here are some other ones. "My mom wants to drink." Yeah.
I know the circles that I keep on social network. I often see people posting these silly sentences, so they must be be quite common.
Yes, exactly. I like this other one. "Are you 18? Here, think of a context for that sentence.
But I mean, as we said, I don't think we're not being critical of Duolingo. There are people that do like the app.
That's true, and people do really like the app. We also heard on our last episode on life sentences that some of these sentences actually could become more memorable. For example, this one here: "Ich gebe meinem Bär Bier." I gave my bear beer. Okay. Very weird, but maybe it would help me remember bear, beer, or whatever those two German words.
Yeah, very, very true. Very true when it comes up there. I was just, it'd be interesting to see again, though, I mean, it was a pop up, it's got millions of views, isn't it? Now, will an app like that suffer with the growth of Translate and Google Translate? Because, for example, in the new Android software, Google Translate is native, so it will translate within an app. So if you use WhatsApp, for example, it will translate for you automatically.
And so if it translates within an app, would it not translate within Duolingo itself as soon as you start keying something in?
So, that's true, yeah. So it'd be interesting to see how that continues. It's just kind of bringing it full circle. One of the other articles, when we found that Google ad that we started with, one of the other articles that I found was, I think, one that's kind of brought out every few months by the Brits, and of course is this idea that the Brits don't need to learn a foreign language.
Yes.
And I suspect this is getting closer and closer to being true.
Well, certainly all the translation things would always work into English. I mean, that's going to be the first language tested out. English and Spanish, and maybe English, Spanish, French, German would be the main languages, or maybe there'll be more and more Chinese things now. But sure. Yeah, it reminds me of that joke. What do you call someone who speaks 3 languages? Trilingual. What do you call someone who speaks 2 languages? Bilingual. What do you call someone who speaks 1 language? English or American. Yes, this is another favorite joke.
Teaching is the profession that teaches all other professions. Author unknown.
I think we're coming to the end of another episode here, Sean.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Well, as always, if anybody has anything they'd like to comment on what we said about universal translators in science fiction and in science fact, about words that have no translation into English, about are these translation apps and devices and everything going to what do they mean for language teachers? We'd love to hear from you either at our website www.TEFLCommute.com or at our Facebook page or indeed on Twitter. You can find us at all those places. Sean, is it time to say au revoir?
It is, and it just reminded me, you didn't say at the beginning, this is a podcast about TEFL, which is that isn't about teaching, but might mention teaching.
Oh, maybe should I try to say that in a language? Ça, c'est un podcast pour des professeurs de langue, mais qui traitent pas de l'enseignement de langue. Doesn't sound quite as good, does it?
It sounds interesting, and on that note, it's probably time to say goodbye and see you again next time.
Bye.
As your commute is coming to an end, here's an activity you can take into class. This activity is a variation of the favourite broken telephone activity and works best with students who share the same language. Write a sentence in English on a piece of paper. Give it to a student who translates it and whispers the translation to the next student. The next student then translates it back into English and whispers the English to the next student. This person translates it into his or her own language and passes it on. Continue this way until you get the last sentence in English, which the student should write on the board. Is it the same as your original sentence? A version of this activity can be found in Philip Kerr's book, Translation and Own Language Activities, published by Cambridge University Press. You can find the instructions for this activity at our website, www.teflcommute.com. You've been listening to the TEFL Commute, an original podcast produced and presented by Lindsay Clanfield, Sean Walden and James Taylor. Don't miss out on any episodes by subscribing to us on iTunes and by visiting us at www.teflcommute.com.